Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, it's been some time since we've taken a look at useful charts. I think it's a really cool way that he uses to explain historical concepts and people by showing charts that show how they connect and how they descend, and things like royal family trees and things of that nature. It's a great way to analyze history through a particular lens, the lens of connectivity through families. So I'll add this particular video we're about to take a look to. I'll add this reaction to our useful charts playlist, which I will pin in the comment section below. But this one is one that especially appeals to me. This is 37 Bible characters found through archaeology. One of the misconceptions that people have, especially people who are not believers in the Bible, and I know many of you are watching that are in that category, but many people have this misconception that the stories in the Bible and the people in the Bible are just all made up. And that there's no historical evidence for them, and that's really just not the case. So even if you don't believe in the supernatural, even if you don't believe in God, honestly, a good way to look at all of this is, if you want to, take out the references to God and the references to the supernatural, and what you're left with is actually a pretty accurate history of many of the events that are described, especially when we're talking about events in the Old Testament, like the books of Kings, for example, and Chronicles. So it's also important to note that when we look at other stories, like stories that have been written down from ancient Greece and from ancient Rome, they also wrote their stories with a heavy involvement of religion, talking about the gods being involved and talking about supernatural things happening. And when we strip away that, we're still left with a story that actually matches up with some records that we have. And the fun thing is that we're finding this stuff all the time. A lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about in this video today is stuff that has just been discovered in the last 150 years, or even in the last couple of decades. So who knows what we'll find tomorrow, or a year from now, or 10 years from now. It's pretty exciting. So with that in mind, I'll put the link down in the description. You can check out this video without my commentary, as well as all the other videos he has. I want to give a shout out and a thank you to Tom Rudd in Nevada, who is one of our patrons who just signed up a few months ago, and I appreciate your support so much. Thomas, thank you. Let's dive in.
This is Matt Baker. A few weeks ago, I did a video on the complete family tree of the Bible using our new biblical family tree poster. I didn't talk about whether or not the characters were historical. I simply went through the tree as it is described by the Bible. Now, while this video was generally very well received, I did get several comments like this. Fun fact, this is based on completely made up fiction. Amazing chart of fiction. All fiction. This has nothing to do with history.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Listen, even if you don't believe in the God of the Bible, you cannot, it's not an option to be able to say that it's all fiction, right? That's just not true, and that's what he's attempting to show here.
Well, here's the thing. The Bible is neither fiction nor is it nonfiction. Those categories simply didn't exist back then. When ancient people wrote, they often mixed stories designed to make a point, with certain details based in reality. And on top of this, it's important to remember that the Bible was written by many authors in several different genres over a long period of time.
Right.
So it's ridiculous to try and use one word, such as fiction, to describe the whole thing.
And here's the bottom line. Much like what we do with science, for example. Listen, I'm not a scientist, but science looks at the evidence that's available and uses that information to come up with an inference as to what they believe is happening, and then you can test it, and then new information comes in that helps you refine that. And that's why, for example, scientific theories often get updated and changed, and you're seeing news stories all the time about how what they thought they believed about the universe has changed because of new information. The Bible is the same way. For most of the last several thousand years, a lot of the West has just the culture has been that we just accept that the Bible is true, right? And then in the last couple of hundred years, there's been a big swing in the other direction. Oh, it's all fiction. Oh, it's all made up. We can't prove any of it. And now we're understanding that, yeah, there's some parts of it we will never be able to prove. And so that's where the element of faith comes in. Obviously, there's plenty of supernatural in there. And whether you believe in that sort of thing or not determines your viewpoint. But we also have more and more evidence that we can piece together that says, you know what? Even if you don't believe, for example, that God created the world in 6 days, even if you don't believe that there was a worldwide flood, you can't say that someone like Ahab never existed. Well, why? Because we know even from extra biblical sources that Ahab existed, so that's kind of where we're at right now with this.
And it's even more ridiculous to say that the Bible has nothing to do with history. There are actually plenty of historical characters mentioned in the Bible. So what I thought I'd do in this video is show you 37 Bible characters that are absolutely 100% not fictional. In every case, these are individuals whose names have been found in the archaeological record.
Now, it's another important point to make here, and I know I've been talking a lot before we even get too far into this. I say this all the time. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So while we can say, okay, now we've confirmed at least some archaeological or other historical record for some of these people, that does not automatically mean that the ones we don't have records for didn't exist. You'd be surprised how many figures in history that we all just accept existed and are real are based on very, very, very thin historical records that are sometimes written hundreds of years after those people existed. A great example of this is Attila the Hun. Everybody just says, yeah, Attila the Hun existed. Of course he did. The evidence we have for him, and he's somebody who came along later than some of these people, is actually way thinner than you might think. And that's the case for a lot of people. Sometimes our basis for a historic figure or historic event is one source that maybe wrote 500 years later.
In other words, outside of the Bible. Basically, ancient history can be divided into 3 main periods: the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and Classical Antiquity. The Bronze Age goes from around 3300 to 1200 BCE. So in terms of the Bible story, this covers everything from shortly after Adam and Eve to the time of Moses and Joshua. The Iron Age then goes from around 1200 BCE to 500 BCE. So that covers everything from the period of the Judges to the destruction of the kingdom of Judah.
And here's the thing, there's even debate about some of these time periods, right? I mean, even if we look at, for example, the evidence that we have for the Egyptian pharaohs, Egyptian history, not even talking about the Bible, there's debate about time frames, sometimes maybe 30, 40, 50-year difference, but archaeologists and historians don't even agree on the times that certain people existed.
The Babylonians. Finally, everything from 500 BCE onwards is what we call classical antiquity. So that's the rest of the chart. In this video, we're only talking about the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament. So really, only the Bronze Age and the Iron Age are of interest to us. This is because almost all of the stories found in the Hebrew Bible occur during these 2 periods. In contrast, everything from the Apocrypha and the New Testament occurs during classical antiquity. I'll perhaps look at characters from those sections of the Bible in a future video. Let me now use this chart to highlight the 37 Bible characters that have been found in the archaeological record.
And you'll notice they're all in the Iron Age or slightly into the Classical Age, and that's to be expected. Our records that we have for the Bronze Age just in many cases don't exist. And again, that doesn't mean that they aren't real. For example, if we look at all of this and we say, wow, a good chunk of the characters mentioned in the Bible that come from the Iron Age really were people that we can say existed from extra biblical records. It's a fair jump to then say there's a good chance that the people in the Bronze Age also existed. Now, one might argue, well, this stuff was written during the Iron Age, so it's more accurate. Yeah, but it doesn't mean this is less accurate. But that's a story for another day.
What do you notice? Almost all of them are from the Iron Age. There's a few from the beginning of classical antiquity, but there are 0, I repeat, 0, from the Bronze Age. This is a very important point that, for some reason, doesn't get the attention that it deserves. But it's absolutely crucial for understanding the Bible. You see, the Hebrew Bible is basically an Iron Age book.
I know that this is a strong argument that has been made, and I studied all of this in college, right? The theories on the different writers and how it was all pieced together. But they're theories, and I'm not discounting or saying they're right. I'm just saying they're theories, and as new evidence comes in, we're going to have more. But there's no reason to think that they had to have been written in the Iron Age. It's just the reality of the historic record, the extra biblical records that are available from the Bronze Age that just aren't there. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that just things weren't left behind the way that they were in the Iron Age. There's a lot of other cultures and other civilizations for which we don't have a lot of written or historical records from the Bronze Age either.
So it should come as no surprise that the Iron Age parts of the Bible are full of characters whose names can be found in the archaeological record, whereas the Bronze Age parts are not. Ironically, at some point, it became popular in certain atheist circles to state that the Bible was written by a bunch of Bronze Age goat herders, which is ridiculous because the Bible was actually written by a bunch of Iron Age city dwellers. Sure, those Iron Age city dwellers wrote that their ancestors were Bronze Age shepherds, but the people doing the actual writing were from the Iron Age.
And here's the thing. Don't discount oral histories, right? Yes, oral histories are, subject to the people who are telling them, but, so is written history. There's historians that wrote down everything. Guys like, a great example of this is Herodotus that we like to talk about. He wrote a lot of stuff down and he embellished a whole bunch of it. Most historians at that time embellished what they were writing. So this idea that because it was an oral history that was passed down means it's less reliable is not really accurate, because things that are written down are often written down from oral histories that were told to them over several hundred years. And there were people who took this very seriously, passing down these oral histories. So even if we accept the premise that it wasn't written down until the exile period, 600-700 BC, that doesn't mean it didn't happen or that it's not true.
Now, lest you think that the difference between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age is no big deal, let me drive home how important the distinction is. During the Bronze Age, the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea saw the rise of many great civilizations, such as the Egyptians, Hittites, and Greeks. But then, around the year 1200 BCE, something strange happened. Archaeologists refer to it as the Bronze Age collapse because rather suddenly the Egyptians, Hittites, and Greeks all went into decline. What followed was an approximately 250-year-long period known as the Greek Dark Ages. What exactly caused the collapse is debated. It may have been a volcano that caused ash to fill the sky, leading to drought. Or it could have been a pandemic, or a major war, or migrations, or a...
So again, this is an example of we're taking the information we have, which in this case is a lack of information, and we're saying there's got to be a reason for this. What happened that caused this collapse of civilizations and this anarchy and this time of just really chaos? And we just don't know. We can infer, we can guess, but until new information comes along, we won't know.
Combination of all these things. But the fact is that the event caused a clear line to be drawn in the sand between the before times and the after times. By the time that the Iron Age people started to once again record things, their memory of the before times was blurry, which is why the ancient Greek accounts of what happened during the Bronze Age, such as the stories found in the Iliad and Odyssey, are very different from the ancient Greek accounts of what happened during the Iron Age, such as the histories written by Herodotus.
But the histories written by Herodotus are full of ridiculous errors and embellishments.
Well, the same is true of the Bible. Everything from the Bronze Age, like the Flood, the Patriarchs, and the Exodus, read more like myth and legend.
See, and I understand my own bias as a Christian is coming into this, but just even looking at the Greek accounts, just because the Iliad and the Odyssey are written in a very particular way and describe events for which we don't have a lot of archaeological evidence, it doesn't mean they weren't based on real events. And the same is true for the Old Testament.
Whereas everything from the Iron Age, like the various kings of Israel and Judah, reads more like history. Now, in this video, I'm not going to go through why I think that the Bronze Age parts of the Bible should be understood as being more literary than literal. Instead, I'm going to focus on the 37 characters from the Iron Age parts that have been demonstrated by archaeology to have been real, because I very specifically want to debunk the idea that the Bible is completely fictional. Let's start with Omri. The Bible barely mentions him, beyond the fact that he became king of Israel and founded the city of Samaria. But he's extremely important for this discussion because he's the earliest Israelite person for whom we have an extra biblical record for that dates close to when he lived.
Yep.
According to the Moabite Mishi stele, discovered in 1868 and now located at the Louvre, Omri was in fact a real person.
And I believe this one was found in Jordan because we actually saw a replica of this in Amman when I was in Jordan a few months ago. And a lot of these are in museums like the Louvre and in the British Museum now and museums in Germany and other places. But here's the thing. Discovered in 1868, right? So before 1868, no record of Omri. And somebody might have argued, well, he didn't exist. And then we found this. And one of the other things that's really great about some of these things that we're finding is that while the people of Israel wrote stuff down on scrolls and they had these oral histories that were later written down, people like the Moabites and the Egyptians and the Babylonians and others often put things in stone, which means that they are being found to this day. And what that helps us as historians to do then is to compare the accounts, right? Because when we're only getting one side, when our stories about the Gallic Wars are only from Caesar's account, then we have to take everything with a grain of salt and say, okay, well, that's what Caesar said, but is that what really happened? Did he inflate the numbers? Did he downplay his own, things, stuff like that? But when we get to see the other side and when they match up pretty well, we can say, you know what? We've got the side from Omri saying these things. We've got the side that was opposing Omri saying these things. And you know what? There's some stuff that matches up. So we can be pretty confident that maybe that did really happen.
It describes how Omri and the Israelites conquered the nearby Moabites, but then how, following Omri's death, Mesha, the king of Moab, managed to drive the Israelites out and restore independence.
The Moabites are a pretty common opponent of the Israelites described in these books of the Bible.
So I'm going to place a verification check mark next to Omri to indicate that his name has been found in the archaeological record. According to the Bible, the next Israelite king after Omri was his son Ahab. The Bible has a lot more to say about Ahab, who was married to Jezebel and who reigned during the time of Elijah the prophet. However, Ahab is also mentioned outside of the Bible. According to the Assyrian Kirk stele, discovered in 1861 and now located in the British Museum.
Notice the theme, the time period, the ending up in a European museum.
Ahab the Israelite was one of the 11 kings who allied together to fight the Assyrians in the year 853 BCE. That same stele also mentions Ben-Hadad II, the king of Aram Damascus in Syria, who also appears in the Bible as a sometimes enemy, sometimes ally of Ahab.
And these things are important because including these names and these details gives a lot of credence to it when you're that specific. And you might find occasionally some discrepancies with the names, and a lot of that has to do with language. Different names have different interpretations in language. So Elijah, for example, in Greek is Elias. Some of the other names like Joshua in the Old Testament. That's in Hebrew, it's Yeshua, which is then translated as Jesus in Greek. They're all the same name. So sometimes you'll see in the Hebrew writing in the Old Testament a name, and it doesn't necessarily match up with the name that you see on an Egyptian stele. That doesn't mean it's inaccurate. It just means that they pronounced it differently.
According to the Bible, Ahab was eventually followed by his son Jehoram, whereas Ben-Hadad II was followed by a usurper named Hazael. Once again, the archaeological record confirms this as being true. Hazael's name has been found on at least 2 objects that date to this period.
Look at how small these are, and just how they're just little pieces of things, but it can tell us so much and can confirm little things. And people probably found a lot of this stuff over the centuries, and it just meant nothing to them, and they just tossed it aside. There's so much out there that hasn't been found yet that's probably buried under the desert somewhere.
In fact, this ivory carving may even depict his likeness. And he was almost certainly the king who commissioned the Tel Dan stele, discovered in 1993.
1993. I was in high school when this was found.
Located at the Israel Museum. The Tel Dan stele is now in pieces, but one piece describes how the king of Aram Damascus defeated both Jehoram, the king of Israel, and Ahaziah from the house of David. This is important.
Yeah, and so there's actually a really fascinating story about how that one came to be in pieces. I'm pretty sure this is the one. It was discovered in one piece, and there was like debate going on about who was going to buy it, and these different, because a lot of these things that ended up in the Louvre or in the British Museum, they weren't stolen per se. They were bought from whoever found them. So sometimes you'd have a local tribe or a chieftain who was in possession of this, and he knew that it was valuable, and he was waiting for some European archaeologists to come along with a big wad of cash and buy it. And what happened in this case was that there was some fighting over who was going to get it, and in their anger, somebody ended up just smashing the thing, and they ended up having to try to put it back together. That might have actually been the Misha stele that story is about, because you see that one's kind of in pieces. I can't remember, but I know it was a prominent one.
For 2 reasons. The first is that the Bible also describes the exact same event. And the second is that this is the earliest mention of the house of David, which ruled in the southern kingdom of Judah. However, please note that the Tel Dan stele does not reference King David specifically.
Right, so it's not a contemporary account of David from his lifetime, but if Ahaziah is saying he's from the house of David, you can pretty well bet that means that at some point in his line there was a guy named David.
Rather, it simply references the house of David, Ahaziah being a member of that house and a descendant of David who reigned approximately 130 years after his death.
So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 generations.
So again, take note. The Tel Dan stele is not a contemporary record of David, nor does it give us any information about any events that occurred during David's lifetime. That said, if there was in fact a house of David, we can presumably assume that there was at least somebody named David who founded that house.
Yeah, this is a perfectly reasonable assumption that if you take your biases out of it and you look at the record, you can say, you know what? There was definitely a guy named David who exists, who was probably a king and who founded this royal house that was reigning in the southern kingdom of Judah.
But since the Tel Dan stele was not made close to David's lifetime, I'm going to have to give David a question mark, not a check. We now come to Jehu, who ruled Israel following Hazael's defeat of Jehoram. Jehu is important because not only is his name found in the archaeological record, his image is as well. So if we go by the criteria, pics or it didn't happen, in this case, we do actually have pics. On the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, discovered in 1846 and now located in the British Museum, Jehu is actually shown bowing down to Shalmaneser III. There, the Assyrians labeled him as Jehu from the house of Omri. According to the Bible, Hazael of Aram Damascus was followed by his son Ben-Hadad.
And we pronounce it as Jehu, but it probably was Yehu, just like we say Jehovah, which is just the translation of Yahweh, which was the Hebrew,
became Ben-Hadad III. This too has been confirmed by archaeology on the Zakar stele. Several of the subsequent kings of Israel show up in Assyrian records as well, including Jehoash, whose name appears on the Assyrian Tel al-Rima stele as Jehoash the Sumerian. Jeroboam II, whose name appears on a seal belonging to someone called Shema, the servant.
That's a really freaking cool piece right there, that seal. That is absolutely incredible stuff.
Of Jeroboam, and Menahem, Pekah, and Hoshea, all of whom appear in Assyrian records as having paid tribute to Tiglath-Pileser III.
So a little background here. You're seeing the northern kingdom of what we call Samaria, and then the southern kingdom that's known as Judah. And how that happened was after Solomon, in the biblical account, Solomon is gone and his son inherits, but then there's a kind of a civil war for the throne at that point. And it ends up splitting into two kingdoms. And sometimes the kingdoms were kind of on the same side against outside opponents, and sometimes they weren't. And the way the Bible describes it, that the northern kingdom had nothing but what they describe as evil kings, whereas the southern kingdom was a mix of good kings and bad kings. And the criteria of good or bad is, did he worship Yahweh or did he not? And so you have the ending of the northern kingdom of Samaria in 722, and then the southern kingdom lasts a little bit longer.
Also mentioned in Tiglath-Pileser's tributary records is Rezin, the final king of Aram Damascus, who shows up in the Bible in both 2 Kings and Isaiah. Now, Tiglath-Pileser himself also appears in the Bible. In fact, he's the earliest Assyrian king to be mentioned. In 2 Kings, he's called Pul, which is short for Pileser.
And it makes sense that that would be the first one mentioned, because this is the point at which that story matters to the story of the biblical account, right? Because now Samaria is going to be destroyed, and so we need to start talking about the people involved in that.
In 1 Chronicles, his full name is used, Tiglath-Pileser, and we have loads of archaeological evidence for him, including many depictions, such as this one shown here. Also mentioned in the Bible are the next two Assyrian kings, Tiglath-Pileser's sons, Shalmaneser V and Sargon II. They helped to destroy Samaria and bring about the end of the kingdom of Israel. Sargon II's son Sennacherib thus turned his attention to the kingdom of Judah. So let's now go over there and take a look. After Ahaziah, who was mentioned on the Tel Dan stele, the next two kings of Judah to appear in the archaeological record are Jotham and Ahaz.
So King Uzziah, who's right above Jotham there, is mentioned in the book of Isaiah. So that allows us to kind of put Isaiah right in this time period, because Isaiah the prophet describes his calling from God as happening in the year that King Uzziah died. And he talks about seeing God seated on his throne, and God says, you know, who will I send and who will go for us? And Isaiah says, here I am, send me. And, there's this whole interaction that happens, and that's when Isaiah's time as a prophet begins.
Their names appear together on a seal discovered in 1995, which reads, belonging to Ahaz, son of Jehoram, king of Judah.
That's amazing.
Which brings us to Hezekiah, one of the most important kings of Judah.
Yep.
According to the Bible, Jerusalem was able to hold off the Assyrians during Hezekiah's reign, allowing Judah to survive when Israel did not. This is confirmed on the Taylor Prism, discovered in 1830 and
look at how much information is on that thing. My goodness.
Now located at the Israel Museum. It records the annals of Sennacherib, which describe the situation like this. As for Hezekiah the Jew, he did not submit to my yoke. I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities and conquered them. Himself I made a prisoner in Jerusalem, his royal residence, like a bird in a cage.
Right, he's describing laying siege to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's up on this hill. It's a very easily defensible position if you have a walled city and you have access to water and things like that.
Hezekiah's name was also found on a seal that includes a depiction of the sun with downward-facing wings, which was presumably Hezekiah's royal seal, because it says, belonging to Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah.
There you go. I mean, I love this archaeological stuff. It's incredible.
It was found in Jerusalem in 2015, and just a few years later, at the same site, another seal was found. This time reading, belonging to Isaiah the Navi. Now this one is controversial because Navi is the Hebrew word for prophet, but it was also at the time simply a common name. So it's possible that this is evidence for the existence of Isaiah the prophet, who...
Here's the thing. When we take our biases out of it, and myself included in that, what's the most likely reason, right? We know that these kings and their stories, at least what we've found so far, have been confirmed by these extra biblical archaeological records. It's fair then to assume, is it not, that if they existed and their stories seem to line up with history, that also when the Bible is writing about Isaiah the prophet having existed during the same time and interacting with these people, the most likely assumption that we can make here is, yes, that is referring to Isaiah the prophet, because it says Isaiah the prophet on it.
Who, after all, did live at the exact same time as Hezekiah,
right,
and was a member of the royal family. However, it also could just refer to some guy named Isaiah Navi.
It could, but doesn't it seem likely?
So once again, I'm going to use a question mark.
See, I'd be a check mark
Manasseh,
there.
However, does get a check mark. He's mentioned on the prism of Esarhaddon as having given tribute to Assyria. Esarhaddon is, of course, mentioned on the prism too, as well as in the Bible. So that's yet another check mark. The Bible even gets a little detail right about the transfer of power between Sennacherib and Esarhaddon. It says that one of Esarhaddon's brothers, named Adramelech, murdered their father Sennacherib. This fact is recorded in several contemporary sources. So that's yet another historical person mentioned in the Bible, and another historical event that the Bible gets correct. The final Assyrian king to be mentioned in the Bible is Ashurbanipal.
Yeah.
After his reign, the Assyrians actually declined in power, which was of great benefit to Judah because it allowed Judah to really thrive.
Right, so Judah is nearly conquered by the Assyrians, but then they get kind of a reprieve and a breather and a time to rebuild, and it helps them to last at least a couple more generations.
This occurred during the reign of Josiah, which is when the initial version of the biblical Book of Kings was likely written. Unfortunately, we do not have any archaeological evidence for Josiah, but we do have evidence for the high priest who served under him, Hilkiah. In 1980, archaeologists found a signet ring which reads, belonging to Hanan, the son of Hilkiah the priest.
That's cool.
Because the ring was able to be dated to the time of Josiah, and because the word priest appears on it, this is almost certainly evidence that the Hilkiah of the Bible was indeed a real person. Now, up to this point...
Now, here's what I don't understand in his assumptions about this stuff. If that one says Hilkiah the priest, and we just accept that it's Hilkiah the priest, why aren't we also accepting when it says Isaiah the prophet in a thing that comes from the time of Isaiah the prophet? I don't know.
I haven't mentioned any Egyptian pharaohs. That's because I've already done an entire video on the pharaohs mentioned in the Bible, which I'll link to in the description. But let me quickly summarize. There are exactly 5 pharaohs mentioned by name in the Bible. And no, the Pharaoh of the Exodus isn't one of them.
No.
The Bible simply refers to him as Pharaoh, which actually makes sense because, like I said earlier, the Exodus took place during the Bronze Age.
But if you look at like an Egyptian historian like Manetho, who I'm going to guess had access to records at the Library of Alexandria, which, oh my gosh, what a loss for world history that was, that those records have been lost. And it wasn't just one big fire, it was multiple. But he wrote the name of the Pharaoh of the Exodus. He referred to the Exodus as a real event, and he said that it was Amenhotep was the name of the Pharaoh. He used the Greek version of Amenhotep, but it was the same name.
Therefore, it was a distant memory by the time of the Iron Age. However, the Bible does mention Shawshank, who it calls Shishak, who reigned...
And there again, there's that difference in language, difference in pronunciation.
...during the time of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. It also mentions Osorkon IV, who it calls King So, and Taharka, who it calls Tirhaka. These two pharaohs reigned around the time of Hezekiah. Next, there's Pharaoh Necho II, who, according to the Bible, was responsible for killing King Josiah. Finally, there's Necho's grandson, Hophra, who reigned around the time that Judah fell to Babylon. Which brings me to the most famous foreign ruler mentioned in the Bible, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stories about Nebuchadnezzar, and there is one of the names that I learned a lot about growing up.
His name, of course, appears in the book of Daniel, but it also shows up in 2 Kings and Jeremiah. And we have several archaeological artifacts that provide evidence for his existence, such as the inscription plaque found on the famous Ishtar Gate, which Nebuchadnezzar had built in Babylon, but which is now located in Berlin.
It's crazy to me they took the entire gate to Berlin, but look how beautiful that is. Absolutely beautiful.
As well as the Babylonian Chronicles, recorded on a series of clay tablets. Babylonian records from the time of Nebuchadnezzar also mention Jeconiah, king of the Jews, who was held prisoner in Babylon and given rations. According to the Bible, Jeconiah was held prisoner for 37 years and was only released by Amel-Marduk, who succeeded his father as king of Babylon. In the Bible, Amel-Marduk is called Evil-Marduk, although note that this has nothing to do with the English word evil. Evil was simply an alternative way to write Amel. Again, the succession described in the Bible matches the succession described in Babylonian records, because Amel-Marduk was in fact the next Babylonian king after Nebuchadnezzar. Now, the next Babylonian king to show up in the Bible is Belshazzar. The Bible refers to him as a son of Nebuchadnezzar, but according to extra-biblical sources, he was more likely his great-grandson. In fact, Belshazzar was...
But I'm arguing about language now at this point, but sometimes when the term son is used, it could be a descendant of any kind. It doesn't necessarily have to mean biological child of.
Probably not even the senior king. According to Babylonian sources, he was simply the crown prince, who ruled alongside his father Nabonidus. But one thing that both the Bible and other sources agree on is that it was during Belshazzar's rule, or co-rule, that Babylon fell to the Achaemenid Persians. And the
very famous story about the writing on the wall, right? Where, his mean Tekelen Parson, and what does that mean? And it's described to him that it means your kingdom is going to be overthrown and going to be handed over to the Medes and the Persians.
The leader of the Achaemenid Persians who conquered Babylon was Cyrus the Great. The book of Isaiah actually refers to him as the Messiah, because it was Cyrus who decreed that the Jews could return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple.
It doesn't call him the Messiah, it just uses that term, which is, just a word that means someone who, a deliverer or something like that.
The book of Ezra describes Cyrus's decree like this: "Any of the Lord's people among you may go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may their God be with them." In 1879, archaeologists found the Cyrus cylinder, originally located in Babylon, but now housed in the British Museum. It describes Cyrus's decree like this: "To the other side of the Tigris River, where many sanctuaries had been abandoned for a long time, I returned their gods to their places, and I let them dwell in eternal abodes." So,
see, that's the thing. Obviously you have a Jewish source saying Cyrus told us we could go back and rebuild our temple and everything. That doesn't mean Cyrus didn't also do the same thing for other conquered peoples. It's just that they're writing from their perspective. Cyrus's account is then writing it from the perspective of his kingdom.
"And I gathered all their inhabitants and returned them to their dwellings." So this is a very good example of how the Bible is definitely not all fiction. The Bible records this very important historical event that occurred right around the transition between the Iron Age and classical antiquity. From this point forward, we no longer have to rely entirely on archaeological finds to learn about the past. Because, starting with the Persian period, ancient people started recording history in a different way, a more straightforward way, with less embellishments and more details. The best example of this is the Greek writer Herodotus, who is called the father of history and who
We're saying less embellishments and more details about Herodotus? All right.
lived right around this time. Herodotus was born shortly after the reign of Darius I, and he died during the reign of Artaxerxes I. These two Persian kings are mentioned both in the Bible and in the works of Herodotus. So that brings our total up to 37 Bible characters who were real historical people. And that's just the Old Testament, or Hebrew Bible. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see a similar video about the New Testament.
All right, I thought that was really well done. He did a great job putting it all together, and I think it's important for us to talk about this stuff and to understand that history is complicated, that a lot of what we think we know is not necessarily the case, and a lot of what we don't know may still yet be found at some point. I'm always excited to hear about the next great archaeological find, whatever it might be. So until next time, let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. I want to thank Owen in San Diego, California, and Dylan in Muncie, Indiana for your support on Patreon. Thank you so much. Check out my entire playlist of videos from Useful Charts. I think he does a fantastic job with his work. Thank you.